October 12, 1955. Warner Brothers Soundstage, Burbank, California. The Rebel Without a Cause set has fallen into the rhythm of another late-night filming session. Director Nicholas Ray calls cut on what should have been a routine scene between teenage sweethearts Jim Stark and Judy. But 17-year-old Natalie Wood doesn't move from her position. She stands frozen, staring at 24-year-old James Dean with an expression that crew members would later describe as pure terror. Something has happened during filming that nobody expected. Something so disturbing that within an hour, Natalie will be in her dressing room, crying hysterically into the phone to her mother. "Mom, you have to come get me," she sobs. "James isn't acting anymore. He's replacing his mother with me. This isn't normal. This isn't right." The phone call that would change how Hollywood understood James Dean's psychological state forever. The night when a 17-year-old girl saw through the charming exterior of America's most promising young actor and recognized something deeply broken, something dangerous, something that made her fear for her own safety and sanity. What did Natalie Wood see that October night that terrified her so completely? What did James Dean do or say that made a seasoned young actress, someone who had been working in Hollywood since childhood, call her mother in panic? The answer reveals the darkest aspect of James Dean's unresolved trauma. His unconscious attempt to transform every young woman in his life into a replacement for the mother he lost at age 9. This is the untold story of the night when Natalie Wood discovered she wasn't playing Jim Stark's girlfriend. She was being forced to play James Dean's dead mother. To understand what happened that October night, you need to understand the psychological state James Dean was in when he arrived on the Rebel Without a Cause set. It was just weeks after his devastating breakup with Pier Angeli, the Italian actress who had shattered his heart by telling him he didn't love real women, only his mother's ghost. Pier's words had exposed the truth about James's relationships. But instead of seeking help to heal his psychological wounds, he had retreated deeper into his dysfunction. James was also still processing the intense emotional work he had done on East of Eden, where director Elia Kazan had captured his raw breakdown on hidden cameras. That experience had stripped away many of his emotional defenses, leaving him psychologically vulnerable and unable to maintain the boundaries between his personal trauma and his professional work. He was living in a constant state of emotional exposure that made every interaction intense and potentially damaging. When James met 17-year-old Natalie Wood for the first time, something shifted in him that was both immediate and deeply disturbing. Natalie was everything that could trigger his mother complex. She was young, beautiful, vulnerable, and possessed an innocence that reminded him achingly of his own childhood before trauma destroyed it. But there was something else about Natalie that made her particularly dangerous to James's psychological stability. She was exactly the age he had been when his emotional development was arrested by his mother's death. And she carried herself with a combination of sophistication and vulnerability that awakened every protective and possessive instinct he had learned from his relationship with Mildred Dean. Born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko in 1938, Natalie had been working in Hollywood since she was a child. But at 17, she still retained an quality of innocence and emotional openness that was rare among young actresses who had grown up in the industry. She was extraordinarily beautiful, with dark hair and expressive eyes that could convey complex emotions with minimal effort. But what attracted James most was her psychological vulnerability. She was at an age where she was transitioning from child to woman, struggling with her own identity and place in the world, desperately seeking approval and guidance from older, more experienced figures in her life. For James, Natalie represented the perfect opportunity to recreate the relationship he had lost with his mother. But this time with him in the protective, nurturing role, rather than the abandoned child role. He could guide her, shape her, be the stable adult presence in her life that he had always wished someone could have been for him. The fact that she was playing his love interest in the film created a dangerous confusion of boundaries that James was psychologically incapable of maintaining. These forgotten stories deserve to be told. If you think so too, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for keeping these memories alive. From their first rehearsals together, James began treating Natalie not like a professional colleague or even a romantic interest, but like a daughter figure who needed his protection and guidance. He would arrive at her dressing room early in the morning with coffee and pastries. Not as romantic gestures, but as parental acts of care. He would walk her to her car after filming, insisting that she shouldn't be alone on the studio lot at night. He began giving her advice about her career, her relationships, her life choices, speaking to her in the tone of a concerned father rather than a peer. Natalie, initially flattered by the attention from someone she admired professionally, gradually began to feel uncomfortable with the intensity and nature of James's interest in her. She was 17 years old and sophisticated beyond her years due to her Hollywood upbringing. But she was still fundamentally a teenager, trying to navigate her own emotional development. James's behavior toward her began to feel less like collegiality and more like something she couldn't quite name, but that made her increasingly anxious. The turning point came during filming of the emotional scenes where Jim Stark comforts Judy after she's been hurt by her parents. In the script, these were meant to be tender romantic moments between two troubled teenagers finding solace in each other. But when the cameras rolled, James began relating to Natalie not as Jim relating to Judy, but as some combination of father figure and romantic partner that created a psychological dynamic so confusing and inappropriate that it disturbed everyone who witnessed it. During one particular scene where Jim was supposed to comfort Judy after a fight with her father, James began speaking to Natalie in a voice that crew members later described as almost hypnotic. He wasn't delivering his scripted lines. He was speaking to her as if she were a wounded child who needed healing, using the tone and cadence that suggested he was unconsciously channeling memories of how he wished someone had comforted him after his mother died. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he whispered to her, holding her face in his hands with an intensity that went far beyond the script's requirements. "I'm here now. I'll take care of you. Nobody will ever hurt you again." The words were beautiful, but the way James delivered them made Natalie's skin crawl. She could see something in his eyes that wasn't Jim Stark looking at Judy, wasn't even James Dean looking at Natalie Wood. It was something else entirely. Something desperate and possessive and inappropriate that made her feel like she was being pulled into a psychological dynamic she was too young and inexperienced to handle. Nicholas Ray, directing from behind the camera, initially thought James was making interesting acting choices that added depth to the character relationship. But as the scene continued and James's behavior became more intense and less connected to the script, Ray began to realize that something was happening that went beyond professional acting. James was projecting something onto Natalie that had nothing to do with the film they were making and everything to do with his own unresolved psychological trauma. "James," Ray called out, trying to redirect the scene. "Let's try that again. But stick closer to the script this time." But James seemed unable to hear him. He was completely absorbed in whatever internal drama he was playing out with Natalie, speaking to her in whispers that the microphones couldn't pick up, touching her in ways that were technically appropriate for the scene, but felt charged with an emotional intensity that made everyone on set uncomfortable. Natalie, trapped in the scene with him, began to panic. She could feel James's need and desperation and confusion radiating off him in waves. And she realized that he wasn't seeing her as a person at all. He was seeing her as some kind of symbol or replacement for something he had lost. And the weight of his projections was crushing her ability to breathe or think clearly. "Cut!" Ray called more forcefully. And this time, the spell was broken. James blinked and stepped back from Natalie, looking confused and slightly embarrassed, as if he wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. Natalie immediately moved away from him, her hands shaking slightly, her face pale with an expression that crew members later described as genuine fear. "Let's take a break," Ray announced, sensing that something had gone very wrong, but not entirely understanding what. During the break, Natalie retreated to her dressing room and tried to process what she had just experienced. She was 17 years old and had been working with adult actors her entire career. But she had never encountered anything like what had just happened with James. She couldn't articulate exactly what had been wrong about their interaction, but every instinct she possessed was screaming that she was in psychological danger from him. When filming resumed, the dynamic between James and Natalie had fundamentally shifted. Where before there had been professional respect and growing friendship, now there was tension and fear on Natalie's side and confused frustration on James's side. He couldn't understand why she was suddenly distant and wary around him, and his attempts to reconnect with her only made her more uncomfortable. James began following Natalie around the set between takes, trying to talk to her about things that had nothing to do with the film. He would tell her stories about his childhood, his relationship with his mother, his feelings about loss and abandonment, speaking to her with an emotional intimacy that was completely inappropriate for their professional relationship and her age. He seemed to need her to understand his pain, to validate his experiences, to provide some kind of emotional support that she was neither qualified nor obligated to give. "You remind me of someone very important to me," he told her during one particularly uncomfortable conversation. "Someone I lost a long time ago. You have the same way of looking at the world, the same kind of gentle spirit." Natalie realized with growing horror that James was talking about his mother, and that somehow in his mind he had begun to conflate her with the woman who had died when he was 9 years old. She understood that she was being asked to carry emotional weight that belonged to a trained therapist, not to a 17-year-old actress trying to do her job. The situation reached its crisis point during the filming of the scene where Jim and Judy share their first kiss. What should have been a tender, age-appropriate romantic moment between two young characters became something psychologically disturbing that made everyone on set uncomfortable. When James kissed Natalie, it wasn't with the awkward sweetness that the script called for between two troubled teenagers finding comfort in each other. It was with the desperate hunger of someone trying to resurrect the dead through physical contact. Natalie felt James's desperation and need in that kiss, felt him trying to pull something from her that she didn't possess and couldn't give. She realized that he wasn't kissing Natalie Wood, the actress, or even Judy, the character. He was kissing some phantom combination of mother and lover that existed only in his traumatized imagination. When Ray called cut on the scene, Natalie immediately left the set and went to her dressing room, where she sat shaking for several minutes before she was able to call her mother. The phone call that followed would become legendary among those who knew about it, though it would remain secret from the public for decades. "Mom, you have to come get me," Natalie sobbed into the phone. "Something's wrong with James. He's not acting anymore. He's replacing his mother with me, and I can't handle it. This isn't normal. This isn't right." Maria Gurdon, Natalie's mother, had been managing her daughter's career since childhood and had dealt with numerous difficult situations involving adult actors and directors. But the terror in Natalie's voice was unlike anything she had ever heard, and she immediately got in her car to drive to the studio. When Maria arrived at the Warner Brothers lot, she found her daughter in a state of near hysteria, trying to explain psychological dynamics that she was too young to fully understand, but old enough to recognize as dangerous. Through her tears, Natalie tried to describe how James had been treating her, not like a colleague or even a romantic interest, but like some kind of replacement for his dead mother, expecting her to provide emotional healing and maternal comfort that she was completely unequipped to offer. "He looks at me like he's seeing someone else," Natalie explained. "And when he talks to me, it's like he's talking to a memory or a ghost. He needs something from me that I can't give him. And when I can't be what he wants me to be, he gets this look in his eyes that scares me." Maria Gurdin immediately went to speak with Nicholas Ray and the producers, demanding that something be done to protect her daughter from what she correctly identified as psychological exploitation. Ray, who had been growing increasingly concerned about James's behavior himself, agreed to have a serious conversation with the young actor about maintaining professional boundaries. If you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Your support means everything to us. But when Ray approached James about the situation, James's reaction revealed just how deep his psychological dysfunction had become. Instead of acknowledging that his behavior had been inappropriate, James became defensive and angry, insisting that he was only trying to help Natalie with her performance and that she was overreacting to his methods. "She's just a kid," James said, seemingly unaware of the irony. "She doesn't understand what real acting requires. I'm trying to help her access deeper emotions, to connect with the truth of her character." Ray realized that James was completely unconscious of what he had been doing, that his projection of maternal figures onto Natalie had been so automatic and deeply rooted in his psychological patterns that he genuinely didn't understand why his behavior was problematic. This made the situation even more dangerous, because James's unconscious motivations made him unpredictable and impossible to reason with on a conscious level. For the remainder of filming, strict boundaries were put in place to protect Natalie from James's psychological projections. Maria Gurdin remained on set during all their scenes together, and Ray assigned assistant directors to monitor James's interactions with Natalie between takes. James was told explicitly that he was to maintain professional distance from his young co-star and was forbidden from discussing personal matters with her. These protective measures allowed filming to continue, but they also created a tension on set that affected the chemistry between the characters. The natural warmth and connection that had initially developed between Jim and Judy was replaced by a guarded awkwardness that, ironically, may have made their performances more realistic for the roles of two damaged teenagers struggling to connect despite their emotional wounds. James, frustrated by his inability to maintain his psychological connection with Natalie, became increasingly erratic in other areas of his life during the final weeks of filming. He began drinking more heavily, driving more recklessly, and engaging in the kind of self-destructive behavior that would characterize his final months. The loss of access to Natalie as a maternal figure seemed to trigger the same abandonment trauma that had been activated by Pier Angeli's rejection, confirming his deep-seated belief that everyone he needed would eventually be taken from him. Natalie Bally, meanwhile, learned a hard lesson about the psychological dangers that could lurk behind professional relationships in Hollywood. The experience with James made her more guarded and careful in her future work with male co-stars, particularly older actors who might try to exploit her youth and vulnerability for their own emotional needs. She would later credit this experience with teaching her to recognize and protect herself from psychological manipulation in both professional and personal relationships. The tragedy of what happened between James and Natalie on the Rebel Without a Cause set is that it revealed the full extent of James's psychological dysfunction, while also demonstrating how dangerous his untreated trauma could be to others, particularly young women who reminded him of what he had lost. His inability to distinguish between his personal emotional needs and his professional responsibilities created a situation where he unconsciously attempted to force a 17-year-old girl to heal wounds that only therapy could address. When Rebel Without a Cause premiered posthumously in 1956, critics and audiences celebrated the chemistry between Jim Stark and Judy, unaware that much of the tension and complexity in their relationship came from real psychological drama happening behind the cameras. The film's exploration of troubled youth and dysfunctional family relationships was more authentic than anyone realized, because it captured real emotional damage being processed in real time. Natalie Wood would go on to have a distinguished career that spanned decades, but she never forgot the lesson James Dean taught her about the difference between acting and psychological exploitation. In later interviews, she spoke about the experience with a mixture of compassion and wariness that revealed how deeply it had affected her understanding of human vulnerability and the responsibility that actors have to each other. James was incredibly talented, but he was also deeply damaged, she said in a 1975 interview. He couldn't separate his personal pain from his professional work, and that made him dangerous to work with, especially for someone like me who was so young and impressionable. I learned that you have to protect yourself from other people's wounds, even when they're trying to create art. The story of James Dean's psychological projection onto Natalie Wood reveals the dark side of method acting when practiced by someone with unresolved trauma. His inability to maintain boundaries between his personal grief and his professional work created a situation where his art became indistinguishable from his psychological dysfunction, putting innocent people in harm's way while he unconsciously tried to heal wounds that had never been properly treated. For James Dean, Natalie Wood represented one last opportunity to recreate the mother-child relationship that had been severed when he was 9 years old. But his attempt to use her as a replacement for Mildred Dean was both psychologically impossible and ethically wrong, demonstrating how unhealed trauma can turn even the most talented artists into unconscious predators who exploit others' vulnerability for their own emotional needs. The night when Natalie Wood called her mother in terror, crying that James Dean was replacing his mother with her, marked the moment when his psychological dysfunction crossed the line from personal tragedy to potential harm to others. It revealed that his wounds had become so infected that they were poisoning every relationship he touched, making him incapable of healthy human connection and dangerous to anyone vulnerable enough to trigger his unconscious need for maternal replacement. James Dean died just weeks after Rebel Without a Cause finished filming, taking with him the possibility of ever learning to heal the wounds that had driven him to unconsciously terrorize a 17-year-old girl. But the damage he did to Natalie Wood in those October nights served as a warning about the responsibility that artists have to address their psychological wounds before they infect their work and harm innocent people who have the misfortune to remind them of what they've lost. James Dean lived only 24 years, but those years were filled with stories the world never heard. Stories of love, pain, rebellion, dreams that died too soon. This channel exists to tell those stories, to remember not just the icon, but the man. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe, because James Dean's story isn't over. Not yet.